Picture this. It's a cold morning in Berlin, 1862. A tall man with a thick mustache and piercing eyes walks into the Prussian Parliament building. He's about to deliver a speech that will change the course of European history. His name is Otto von Bismarck, and he's just been appointed Minister-President of Prussia. The liberals in Parliament are already suspicious of him. They've heard the rumors about this conservative Junker who drinks too much and fights duels. What they don't know yet is that this man has a plan so audacious, so calculated, that within 9 years he will reshape the entire map of Europe. Bismarck steps up to the podium. The room falls silent, and then he says something that will echo through history. He tells them that the great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority votes. No, they will be decided by blood and iron. Blood and iron. The phrase hangs in the air like gunpowder smoke. The liberals are horrified. They think this man is a warmonger, a relic from a barbaric past. But Bismarck knows something they don't. He knows that Prussia is surrounded by enemies. He knows that the only way to unite the fractured German states is through victory in war. And he knows exactly how to do it. Before we dive into the wars that created modern Germany, we need to understand what Germany even was in 1862. Because here's the thing that most people don't realize. Germany, as we know it today, didn't exist. Instead, there were dozens of small kingdoms, duchies, and city-states loosely bound together in something called the German Confederation. Think of it like the European Union, but even more fragmented and with way more princes. You had Bavaria in the south, with its beer halls and Catholic traditions. You had Saxony in the east, still proud of its cultural heritage. You had tiny states like Schaumburg-Lippe that you needed a magnifying glass to find on a map. And then you had Prussia. Prussia was different. Prussia was a military state with a country attached to it, as the saying went. It had been forged in the crucible of the 30 Years' War and tempered by Frederick the Great. Its army was legendary. Its bureaucracy was efficient. Its Junker aristocracy lived and breathed military service. But Prussia had a problem. It was divided. The main part of Prussia was in the east, centered on Berlin. But Prussia also controlled territories in the Rhineland, way over to the west, separated by hundreds of miles of other German states. This geographic split made Prussia vulnerable. It meant that in any major European conflict, Prussia's western territories could be cut off from its heartland. Bismarck understood this, and he understood that to make Prussia truly powerful, to unite all Germans under Prussian leadership, he would need to eliminate this vulnerability. Now, there was another major player in this German drama, Austria. The Austrian Empire was enormous, stretching from northern Italy to the borders of Russia. It included Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, and yes, Germans. For centuries, Austria had been the dominant German power. The Holy Roman Emperor had always been Austrian. Even after Napoleon dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, Austria still claimed leadership of the German Confederation. The Austrian emperor expected the other German states to follow his lead, and most of them did, because Austria was powerful, prestigious, and had centuries of tradition on its side. But Bismarck saw things differently. He looked at Austria and saw weakness disguised as strength. The Austrian Empire was too diverse, too sprawling. It was trying to hold together dozens of different peoples who increasingly wanted independence. Its finances were a mess. Its army, while large, was poorly equipped compared to Prussia's. Most importantly, Austria was Catholic and reactionary, while northern Germany was increasingly Protestant and progressive. Bismarck believed that Germany's future lay with Prussia, not Austria, but he couldn't just say this out loud. He had to maneuver carefully, because Austria still had powerful friends among the German states. So Bismarck waited. He strengthened Prussia's army, modernizing it with new breech-loading rifles that could fire 5 times faster than the old muzzle loaders. He built relationships with key diplomats across Europe. He studied his enemies and potential allies with the attention of a chess master planning 20 moves ahead. And then, in 1863, opportunity knocked. Denmark made a fatal mistake. The Danish king signed a new constitution that tried to incorporate the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein more tightly into Denmark. This doesn't sound like much, but it was explosive. You see, Holstein was part of the German Confederation. It was majority German-speaking. Schleswig was more mixed, but it had a large German population. Germans across the Confederation were outraged by Denmark's move. Nationalist sentiment was rising. People wanted action. This was exactly the kind of situation Bismarck had been waiting for. A clear injustice, popular support for action, and an enemy that Prussia could definitely beat. But here's where Bismarck's genius shows. Instead of Prussia acting alone, he convinced Austria to join in a war against Denmark. Think about the brilliance of this move. By bringing Austria in as a partner, Bismarck ensured that no other major European power would intervene on Denmark's behalf. Britain might have supported Denmark, but they wouldn't risk war with both Prussia and Austria. France under Napoleon III was watching carefully, but would stay neutral as long as the German powers were united. Russia, well, Russia had its own reasons to stay out of it. More importantly, by fighting alongside Austria, Bismarck was setting up the next phase of his plan, because this war would create a situation that would inevitably lead to conflict between Prussia and Austria. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The war against Denmark began in February 1864. It was a cold winter, and the Prussian and Austrian armies moved north toward the Danish border. The Danish army wasn't weak. They had modern fortifications, particularly at Dibble, a fortress complex that controlled access to the Danish heartland. The Danes were betting on these fortifications. They were also betting on international support that never came. The British government made sympathetic noises but sent no troops. The Russians had their own problems. The French watched and waited. Denmark was alone. On April 18, 1864, the Prussian army launched its assault on Dibble. The bombardment began at dawn. Prussian artillery, some of the best in Europe, pounded the Danish fortifications. The Danish defenders fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One Danish soldier, a lieutenant named Christian Raven, wrote in his diary that morning about watching the Prussian shells arc through the sky like deadly meteors. He described how the earth shook with each impact, how the wooden palisades splintered like matchsticks, how the screams of wounded men mixed with the roar of artillery. Raven survived the initial bombardment, but barely. His position was overrun by Prussian infantry in the afternoon. He was captured, wounded, and would spend the rest of the war in a Prussian hospital. The fall of Dibble was decisive. Within weeks, Denmark sued for peace. By October 1864, the Treaty of Vienna was signed. Denmark lost Schleswig and Holstein. But here's where things get interesting. The treaty didn't say who would control these duchies. Instead, they would be jointly administered by Prussia and Austria. Can you see the trap Bismarck had laid? Two rival powers trying to jointly govern two territories with no clear agreement on who was really in charge. It was a recipe for conflict, an intentional recipe for conflict. For the next 2 years, tension built between Prussia and Austria. Every little administrative decision in Schleswig and Holstein became a test of wills. Austria wanted to give the duchies to the Duke of Augustenburg, a minor German prince. Prussia wanted to annex them directly. The other German states watched nervously, most of them siding with Austria out of fear of Prussian ambition. Bismarck didn't care. He was methodically preparing for the next war. He modernized Prussia's railway system, understanding that the ability to move troops quickly would be crucial. He reorganized the army under Helmuth von Moltke, a brilliant strategist who believed in the offensive use of railways and telegraph communications. And most cleverly of all, he made a deal with Italy. Italy, you see, was in a similar situation to Prussia. It had recently unified most of the Italian peninsula, but Austria still controlled Venetia in the north. The Italians desperately wanted Venetia back. So Bismarck offered them a deal. If war broke out between Prussia and Austria, Italy would attack Austria from the south. In return, Italy would get Venetia. This was brilliant strategy. Austria would have to fight a two-front war, splitting its forces. Meanwhile, Bismarck was also working on neutralizing France. Napoleon III, the French emperor, was ambitious but also cautious. Bismarck met with him secretly and hinted that if France stayed neutral in a Prussian-Austrian war, Prussia might support French territorial gains elsewhere. Maybe in Belgium, maybe in Luxembourg. Bismarck had no intention of actually doing this, but Napoleon III didn't need to know that yet. By spring of 1866, war was inevitable. Austria demanded that the German Confederation settle the Schleswig-Holstein question. Bismarck rejected Austrian terms and proposed that the German Confederation itself should be dissolved and reformed without Austria. This was the ultimate provocation. Austria called for the Confederation to mobilize against Prussia. Most of the German states sided with Austria. Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, and others all prepared to send troops. On paper, Austria and its allies had overwhelming superiority. The Austrian army alone numbered 400,000 men. Add in the other German states, and the total force against Prussia was over 600,000. Prussia had maybe 300,000 troops, and that was if you counted reserves. Military experts across Europe predicted a long, grinding war that would end in Austrian victory. But these experts were about to learn a lesson in modern warfare. War was declared in June 1866. Within days, Prussian armies were moving with unprecedented speed. Moltke had divided the Prussian army into 3 separate forces, each moving along different railway lines toward Bohemia, where they would concentrate before the decisive battle. This was revolutionary. Most armies of the time moved as a single massive column, slow and vulnerable. Moltke was using the railway and telegraph to coordinate separate armies that would unite only at the moment of battle. It was risky. If the Austrians could defeat one Prussian army before the others arrived, the whole strategy would collapse. But Moltke had calculated the timing perfectly. The Austrian commander, Ludwig von Benedek, was a capable officer, but he was facing an impossible situation. He had to defend Bohemia against 3 Prussian armies approaching from different directions. He had to worry about the Italians attacking from the south. His own army, while brave, was equipped with outdated muzzle-loading rifles that were no match for the Prussian breech-loaders. And critically, his supply lines were a mess because the Austrian railway system wasn't as developed as Prussia's. Benedek knew he was in trouble. He reportedly told the Austrian emperor that he should find a different commander, someone luckier. But by then it was too late to change leadership without causing chaos. On July 3, 1866, the armies met at Königgrätz, also known as Sadowa. It would be one of the most decisive battles of the 19th century. The morning began with fog hanging over the Bohemian countryside. The Austrian army, nearly 200,000 strong, held strong defensive positions along ridges and behind earthworks. The Prussians, approaching from multiple directions, had similar numbers when all 3 armies were combined. But early in the morning, only one Prussian army had arrived. The Elbe army, under Prince Friedrich Karl, attacked the Austrian positions head-on. This was the bait. Friedrich Karl's men advanced through withering Austrian artillery fire. The Prussian infantry, lying prone and firing their breech-loading rifles, were more effective than the Austrians expected, but they were still taking heavy casualties. A young Prussian officer named Helmuth von Moltke, the Younger, nephew of the great general, was with the Elbe army that morning. Years later, he wrote about the chaos of the battle. He described how the fog gradually lifted, revealing the massive Austrian positions. He wrote about the sound, the constant roar of artillery that made normal speech impossible. He remembered a moment when his horse was shot out from under him, and he fell into a ditch full of wounded men. He helped bandage a soldier who was crying for his mother, all while shells exploded around them. He wrote that he felt certain he would die that morning. But then around noon, everything changed. The Second Army under Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm had been marching hard all morning. They arrived on the Austrian right flank exactly when Moltke Sr. had calculated they would. The Prussian guns opened up from a new direction. Suddenly, the Austrians were facing attacks from 2 sides. Benedek tried to refuse his flank, turning part of his army to face this new threat, but it created gaps in the Austrian line. And then the First Army arrived on the opposite flank. The Austrians were now being attacked from 3 directions at once. Benedek's carefully prepared defensive positions were suddenly death traps. His soldiers fought with desperate courage, but the situation was hopeless. By late afternoon, the Austrian army was in full retreat. The Prussians had won one of the most complete victories in modern military history. Austrian casualties were enormous. Nearly 45,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Prussian losses were much lighter, around 9,000. But more than the numbers, it was the speed and decisiveness of the victory that shocked Europe. Now here's where Bismarck showed that he was more than just a warmonger. The Prussian generals wanted to march on Vienna. They wanted to humiliate Austria completely, to dictate harsh terms from the Austrian capital. King Wilhelm I himself supported this idea. But Bismarck argued passionately against it. He understood something crucial. Prussia didn't need to destroy Austria. Prussia just needed to push Austria out of German affairs. If Prussia humiliated Austria too thoroughly, it would create a permanent enemy hungry for revenge. Instead, Bismarck proposed relatively lenient terms. Austria would leave the German Confederation. Austria would recognize Prussian annexation of Schleswig-Holstein. Austria would pay a small indemnity, but Austria would keep all its other territories, including Venetia, which would be given to Italy as Prussia had promised. The king was furious. The generals thought Bismarck was throwing away the fruits of victory, but Bismarck stood firm. He even threatened to resign. He understood that Prussia's next war would be against France, not Austria. And when that war came, he wanted Austria to be neutral, maybe even friendly. A humiliated Austria would align with France. A lenient peace might keep Austria neutral. This was thinking several moves ahead. The Treaty of Prague, signed in August 1866, followed Bismarck's wishes. The war had lasted only 7 weeks. The 7 Weeks' War, people called it. In that short time, the entire balance of power in Central Europe had shifted. Prussia annexed Hanover, Hesse, Nassau, and Frankfurt. These territories connected Prussia's eastern and western lands, eliminating the geographic vulnerability that had worried Bismarck. Prussia formed the North German Confederation, a new organization that united all the German states north of the Main River under Prussian leadership. The southern German states, Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg, remained independent, but they signed secret military alliances with Prussia. Austria was completely excluded from German affairs, but Bismarck wasn't finished. He had united northern Germany, but the southern German states remained separate. They were culturally German, they spoke German, they were part of the broader German national movement, but they were also Catholic, suspicious of Protestant Prussia, and friendly with France. To complete German unification, Bismarck needed to bring the South into the fold, and that would require one more war, a war that would unite all Germans against a common enemy, a war against France. Now you might be wondering why France would go to war with Prussia. After all, France was the most powerful nation in continental Europe. France had the largest army, the most modern navy, and a glorious military tradition stretching back to Napoleon. Why would France risk war with a rising Prussia? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to prestige, paranoia, and one very clever manipulation by Bismarck. Napoleon III, the French emperor, was in a difficult position. He had come to power promising to restore French glory. He had fought wars in Crimea, in Italy, in Mexico. Some had gone well, others not so much. His adventure in Mexico had been a disaster. By 1870, his regime was increasingly unpopular at home. He needed a foreign policy success to shore up his position. More importantly, Napoleon III had been watching Prussia's rise with growing alarm. The Austrian defeat had shocked him. Suddenly, there was a powerful unified state right on France's eastern border. The balance of power that France had maintained for centuries was threatened. Napoleon needed to check Prussian expansion. His opportunity seemed to come in 1870, over a question that seems almost trivial in retrospect. The Spanish throne was vacant. The Spanish government offered the crown to Leopold von Hohenzollern, a German prince from a cadet branch of the Prussian royal family. This offer was made without consulting Bismarck, but when he heard about it, he immediately saw its potential. If Leopold became king of Spain, France would be surrounded by Hohenzollern monarchs, one in Berlin and one in Madrid. The French government would never accept this. And indeed, when news of the candidacy became public in July 1870, France exploded in outrage. The French foreign minister, the Duke of Gramont, made inflammatory speeches. He demanded that Leopold withdraw his candidacy. He implied that France would go to war if necessary. Under this pressure, Leopold did withdraw. He sent word that he was no longer interested in the Spanish throne. This should have been a French diplomatic victory, but it wasn't enough for Napoleon III and his advisors. Flushed with their apparent success, they made a fatal error. They demanded more. The French ambassador, Count Benedetti, was instructed to meet with the Prussian king Wilhelm V, who was vacationing at the spa town of Bad Ems. Benedetti was to demand that the king guarantee that no Hohenzollern would ever seek the Spanish throne again. Not just Leopold, but any Hohenzollern, forever. This was an outrageous demand, an insult to Prussian sovereignty. King Wilhelm politely but firmly refused to give such a guarantee. The meeting was cordial. Wilhelm had nothing against France. He sent a telegram to Bismarck in Berlin, describing the encounter and asking for advice. This telegram, the famous Ems dispatch, was Bismarck's opportunity. When he received the telegram, Bismarck was having dinner with Moltke and another general. They were discussing whether war with France was inevitable. Moltke thought it was. He believed that France would attack Prussia eventually, and it was better to fight now while Prussia was strong. As they talked, Bismarck read the telegram, and then he smiled. He edited the telegram before releasing it to the press. Now, Bismarck didn't change any facts. He didn't make anything up. But by cutting out certain phrases and making the language more abrupt, he changed the tone completely. The original telegram described a polite diplomatic exchange. Bismarck's edited version made it sound like the French ambassador had made insulting demands, and the Prussian king had brusquely rejected them. When the edited telegram was published, it inflamed both French and German public opinion. In Paris, people read it as proof that Prussia had insulted France. In Berlin, people read it as proof that France had insulted Prussia. Suddenly, both nations were demanding war. Napoleon III, under pressure from his generals and his wife, the Empress Eugénie, decided he had no choice. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. This was exactly what Bismarck wanted. France had declared war, which meant France was the aggressor. The southern German states, bound by their military alliances with Prussia, had to honor those treaties. Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg mobilized their armies and joined Prussia. For the first time, all German states were fighting together against a common enemy. German nationalism surged. The Protestant North and Catholic South united in the face of French aggression. It was everything Bismarck had planned for. But now the war had to be won. And despite all of Bismarck's diplomatic genius, wars are won on the battlefield, not in the chancellery. The French army was formidable. It had 300,000 men on active duty, with another 400,000 in reserve. French soldiers had extensive combat experience from colonial wars in Algeria and Mexico. The French chassepot rifle was actually superior to the Prussian needle gun, with longer range and more accuracy. French artillery included the revolutionary mitrailleuse, an early machine gun that could fire 150 rounds per minute. On paper, France looked like it might actually win. But the French had critical weaknesses. Their mobilization system was chaotic. While Prussia could use railways to move entire army corps in days, French reservists were struggling to even find their units. The French high command was divided and disorganized. Napoleon III nominally commanded the army, but he was increasingly ill and not a military genius. Worse, the French war plan was defensive. They planned to wait for the Prussians to attack, then defeat them in fortified positions. Moltke, on the other hand, planned to attack immediately. 3 German armies, totaling over 400,000 men, would invade France through Alsace and Lorraine. They would use the same strategy that had worked against Austria: separate armies advancing on different axes, coordinated by telegraph and railway, concentrating at the decisive moment. The difference was that this time all the armies were actually German, including the southern states. It was the first time in centuries that Germans had fought together as one people. The war began in early August. The Germans advanced into Alsace with shocking speed. The French were still mobilizing when Prussian troops crossed the border. The first major battle occurred at Wissembourg on August 4th. A single French division, badly outnumbered, fought desperately against an entire German army corps. They held for hours but eventually had to retreat. French casualties were heavy. The commander, General Douai, was killed by artillery fire. 2 days later came the Battle of Worth. Marshal MacMahon, commanding the French Third Corps, had taken up strong positions on high ground near the town of Worth. He had about 40,000 men. The Germans, under Crown Prince Friedrich, had over 80,000. But MacMahon's position was excellent. His artillery dominated the approaches. His infantry was dug in behind walls and buildings. For hours, the Germans attacked and were bloodily repulsed. The French chassepot rifles were devastating at long range. German casualties mounted. A young German lieutenant named Ernst von Brandt wrote later about the horror of those attacks. He described watching his company, over 100 men, reduced to just 30 in a few hours. He described the screams of wounded men lying in open fields where no one could reach them. He described how the smell of blood and gunpowder mixed with the summer heat became unbearable. But the Germans kept coming, wave after wave of infantry, supported by artillery that gradually overwhelmed the French guns. By afternoon, German troops had worked around the French flanks. McMahon, seeing his position becoming untenable, ordered a retreat. It was a fighting retreat, and the French cavalry charged repeatedly to cover the withdrawal. But it was a retreat nonetheless. The Germans had won. French losses were about 11,000. German losses were nearly as high, around 10,000. But the strategic situation was clear. The Germans were advancing. The French were falling back. The psychological impact was enormous. The myth of French military invincibility was shattered, and the war had barely begun. Over the next few weeks, the Germans won battle after battle at Spicheren, at Mars-la-Tour, at Gravelotte. The French fought bravely, but they were constantly outmaneuvered. Moltke's system of coordinated armies was working perfectly. French commanders never knew where the next attack was coming from. By late August, the main French army, now commanded by Marshal Bazaine, was trapped in the fortress city of Metz. Over 170,000 French soldiers were besieged there, unable to break out. Napoleon III, watching his empire crumble, decided to personally take command of a relief force. He would march to Metz and free Bazaine's army. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation. The relief army, commanded by Marshal McMahon, with Napoleon accompanying, consisted of about 130,000 men. They marched northeast toward Metz. But Moltke was tracking their every move. He redirected German armies to intercept them. On September 1, 1870, the French army reached the small fortress town of Sedan, near the Belgian border. They were exhausted, their supplies were running low, and they were completely surrounded by over 200,000 German troops. The Battle of Sedan began at dawn on September 1. German artillery, positioned on the heights around the town, opened fire. There were over 600 German guns, and they poured shells into the trapped French army. The French tried to break out, launching desperate cavalry charges that were cut down by German infantry fire. The French cavalry, some of the finest in Europe, charged again and again with suicidal bravery. One charge, led by General Margaret, saw French horsemen riding into mass German rifle fire. Margaret himself was shot through the face and died hours later. His men kept charging even after he fell. A French cavalryman named Paul de Bourgoin survived one of these charges. He wrote about it years later. He described the moment when his unit was ordered to charge. They knew it was suicide. They could see the German infantry formed in squares, rifles ready. They could hear the officers shouting orders in German, but they charged anyway because that's what cavalry did. Bourgoin's horse was shot and fell, pinning his leg. He watched the rest of his squadron ride into the German lines and disappear in smoke and gunfire. Only a handful made it back. He lay there under his dead horse for hours, listening to the battle rage around him, until German soldiers found him and pulled him free. He spent the rest of the war in a prison camp in Prussia. By mid-afternoon, it was over. The French army at Sedan had been annihilated. Over 17,000 French soldiers were dead or wounded. Another 100,000 were captured. The Germans lost about 9,000 men. But the most significant capture was Napoleon III himself. The Emperor of France, the nephew of the great Napoleon, surrendered personally to the King of Prussia. It was one of the most humiliating moments in French history. When news reached Paris, the Second Empire collapsed. A new government, the Government of National Defense, was proclaimed. They vowed to continue the war. But without Napoleon, without the army at Sedan, without the army at Metz still besieged, how could they? The Germans marched on Paris. By September 19th, the city was surrounded. Paris, the greatest city in Europe, was under siege. The French government refused to surrender. They organized new armies in the provinces, using National Guard units and hastily trained recruits. These new armies fought with desperate courage, but they lacked the training and equipment to challenge the professional German forces. The siege of Paris lasted for months. It was a harsh winter. Food ran short. Parisians ate horses, then dogs and cats, then rats. The zoo animals were slaughtered for meat. People made bread from sawdust. The government of national defense tried to break the siege, launching attacks from inside the city and coordinating with the provincial armies outside. But every attack was repulsed. Meanwhile, something historic was happening at Versailles. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the German princes gathered. King Wilhelm I of Prussia stood before them, and Bismarck orchestrated the ceremony that would change European history. Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor, Kaiser of a unified German empire. The southern German states had agreed to join. All the German states except Austria were now part of one nation. Germany, as we know it, was born. The ceremony was deliberately held at Versailles, the palace of Louis XII, the Sun King who had once dominated Europe. It was a symbol. Germany was now the dominant power in continental Europe, and France's centuries of primacy were over. Paris finally surrendered on January 28, 1871. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Frankfurt in May. The terms were harsh. France had to pay a huge indemnity of 5 billion francs. France had to accept German occupation until the indemnity was paid. And most painfully, France had to cede Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. These provinces, though German-speaking, had been part of France for 2 centuries. The loss was a humiliation that France would never forget. It would poison Franco-German relations for generations. It would be one of the underlying causes of World War I. But in 1871, Germany was triumphant. Bismarck had achieved everything he set out to do. Through 3 calculated wars, he had united Germany under Prussian leadership. So what do we make of Bismarck's achievement? On one level, it's impossible not to admire the sheer audacity and intelligence of what he did. He saw the geopolitical situation clearly. He understood how to manipulate other powers. He knew when to fight and when to make peace. He unified a nation that had been divided for centuries. But there's a darker side to consider. Bismarck's success was built on war. 3 wars in 7 years, tens of thousands of men dead, families destroyed, cities besieged, nations humiliated, and the Germany he created was fundamentally militaristic. Its constitution gave enormous power to the Kaiser and the army. The Reichstag, the German parliament, had limited real authority. This would have consequences. More immediately, Bismarck's wars changed the European balance of power in ways that created future problems. By defeating Austria in 1866, he pushed the Austrian Empire toward an alliance with Germany that would drag Europe into World War I. By humiliating France and taking Alsace-Lorraine, he created a permanent French desire for revenge. The map of Europe that Bismarck drew in 1871 contained the seeds of conflicts that would explode in 1914. But none of this diminishes what Bismarck accomplished in those crucial years. He was a master strategist, perhaps the greatest practitioner of realpolitik in history. He understood that power, not ideals, determined outcomes in international affairs. He knew that wars could be tools of policy if used carefully and for limited objectives. He proved that a smaller power could defeat larger ones through superior strategy and willpower. The soldiers who fought in these wars had no such grand perspective. They experienced war at its most brutal and immediate level. Consider Friedrich Wilhelm Noble, a Prussian infantryman who fought in all 3 wars. His letters home, preserved in a Berlin archive, give us a window into the soldier's experience. In 1864, fighting against Denmark, he wrote with excitement about his first battle, about the glory of serving his king. By 1866, his tone had changed. After Königgrätz, he wrote about the screams of wounded men, about friends who died beside him, about the nightmares that kept him awake. By 1870 in France, his letters were dark. He wrote about looting French villages because his unit hadn't been paid. He wrote about summary executions of franc-tireurs, French irregular fighters. He wrote about how much he hated the French, but also how much he hated the war. In his last letter, dated December 1870, he wrote to his wife about the siege of Paris. He described standing guard duty in the freezing cold, watching the lights of Paris in the distance. He wondered what the people inside the city were going through. He wondered if French soldiers, standing guard on the other side, felt the same as he did, tired, cold. wanting nothing more than to go home. He ended the letter by saying he hoped the war would end soon and that Germany would finally have peace. Friedrich Wilhelm Noble survived the war. He returned home to his village in Brandenburg. He worked as a school teacher for the rest of his life. He rarely talked about the wars. When his students asked him what it was like, he would only say that war was necessary sometimes, but it was never glorious. On the other side, consider the experience of someone like Émilie Carpentier, a Parisian woman who kept a diary during the siege. In September 1870, she wrote with defiance about how Paris would never surrender, how the Germans would be defeated. By November, she was writing about hunger, about eating horse meat and pretending it was beef. By January, she wrote about her neighbor's child who died of starvation. She wrote about the rats she and her sister caught and cooked. She wrote about how the sound of German artillery had become so constant that you stopped noticing it. When Paris finally surrendered, she wrote that she felt relief, then shame for feeling relief. She wrote about watching German soldiers march through Paris in a victory parade. She wrote about how some Parisians wept, while others just stood and watched with dead eyes. She wrote that she would never forgive Germany, never, even if she lived to be 100. These personal stories remind us that behind every great historical event, behind every strategic decision and diplomatic maneuver, there are real people whose lives are forever changed. Bismarck's wars unified Germany, but they also killed over 150,000 soldiers and countless civilians. They created hatreds that would echo for generations. They established patterns of militarism and nationalism that would poison European politics. Yet at the same time, they created a nation. Germany before 1870 was a collection of small states, many of them barely viable on their own. After 1871, Germany was a great power, perhaps the greatest power in Europe. German industry boomed. German science and culture flourished. German standards of living rose dramatically. For ordinary Germans, unification brought real benefits. Bismarck himself seemed to understand the ambiguity of what he had created. After 1871, he spent the next 2 decades trying to preserve the peace in Europe. He created a complex system of alliances designed to isolate France and prevent any coalition from forming against Germany. He repeatedly said that Germany was a satiated power, that it had no further territorial ambitions. He worried that the new German Empire was fragile, that it could be destroyed by another major war. In 1888, he told a journalist that the whole of the Balkans wasn't worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. He meant that Germany should avoid being drawn into conflicts that didn't directly affect German interests. He knew that his achievement, this unified Germany, could be undone by overreach. But Bismarck's wisdom didn't outlive him. He was forced to resign in 1890 by the young Kaiser Wilhelm II, who wanted to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. Wilhelm II believed Germany should be a world power, not just a European power. He wanted colonies, a big navy, a place in the sun. The careful balance that Bismarck had maintained collapsed. The alliance system broke down. Germany became increasingly isolated. And in 1914, just 43 years after the German Empire was proclaimed at Versailles, Europe exploded into World War I. That war would destroy the German Empire, along with the Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. It would kill millions and devastate a generation, and it would lead inexorably to an even more terrible war 25 years later. So we come full circle. Bismarck's wars of unification, so carefully calculated and limited in their objectives, ended up creating the conditions for unlimited war in the 20th century. The militaristic culture of the German Empire, the French desire for revenge, the complex alliance systems, the nationalist ideologies. All of these grew from the seeds planted between 1864 and 1871. This is the paradox of Bismarck. He was a genius, but his genius created a monster. He sought to strengthen Germany through war, but the Germany he created would ultimately be destroyed by war. He practiced realpolitik with supreme skill, but in doing so, he helped create a world where realpolitik would lead to catastrophe. Yet we can't simply dismiss Bismarck as a villain or a monster. He was a product of his time, and by the standards of his time, he was remarkably restrained. Compare his wars to Napoleon's total wars that devastated Europe for a generation. Compare his peace settlements to the harsh terms imposed after World War I. Bismarck fought limited wars for specific objectives, and he made peace as soon as those objectives were achieved. He didn't seek to destroy his enemies, only to defeat them. After 1871, he genuinely tried to maintain peace. These are not the actions of a warmonger or a fanatic. They're the actions of a pragmatist who understood that power must be exercised with care. The legacy of Bismarck's wars is complex and contradictory. They unified Germany, which was a genuine achievement. They demonstrated that wars could be fought for limited political objectives and ended quickly with negotiated settlements. They showed the importance of military innovation, strategic planning, and diplomatic preparation. But they also normalized war as a tool of policy. They created nationalist hatreds that poisoned European relations. They built a militaristic German state that would eventually lead Europe to disaster. Understanding this legacy is important not just for understanding 19th century history, but for understanding the nature of power and war itself. Bismarck's famous phrase, "blood and iron," captures something essential about his approach. He believed that great questions would be decided not by votes and speeches, but by force. He was right, at least in his context. The unification of Germany couldn't have been achieved through democratic means or diplomatic negotiation. The other European powers would never have agreed to it. Austria would never have voluntarily given up its position in Germany. France would never have accepted a powerful unified German state on its border. Force was necessary, but Bismarck also understood that force alone wasn't enough. You needed strategy, diplomacy, timing, and the willingness to make peace once you achieved your objectives. This combination of military power and diplomatic skill, of iron and calculation, was what made Bismarck successful. The three wars of German unification were among the most important events of the 19th century. They changed the map of Europe. They altered the balance of power. They demonstrated new ways of waging war using railways and telegraphs. They showed that careful strategic planning could overcome numerical superiority. They proved that a rising power could challenge the established order and win. But most importantly, they created Germany. This Germany, unified under Prussian militarism and Bismarckian realpolitik, would dominate European affairs for the next 75 years. It would fight 2 world wars. It would be divided and then reunified. It would commit terrible crimes and then transform into a peaceful democracy. All of this history stems from those crucial years between 1864 and 1871, when Bismarck remade the map of Europe with blood and iron. As we look back on these events from our perspective, over 150 years later, what lessons can we draw? Perhaps the most important is that war, even limited war fought for rational objectives, has unpredictable consequences. Bismarck couldn't foresee how the Germany he created would evolve after his death. He couldn't predict World War I or World War II. He couldn't imagine the Holocaust or the Cold War division of Germany. These weren't his intentions. He simply wanted to unify Germany and make Prussia the dominant German power. But once you unleash military force, once you normalize war as a tool of policy, you can't control where it leads. The wars Bismarck started with such calculation and control helped create the total wars of the 20th century that he would have abhorred. Another lesson is about the relationship between democracy and war. Bismarck's wars were decided by a small elite, the Prussian king, his ministers, his generals. The German people had little say in whether these wars would be fought. This allowed for quick, decisive action. It allowed for strategic flexibility. But it also meant that wars were fought without popular oversight or democratic accountability. The wars were successful in the short term, but they established patterns of militarism and authoritarian decision-making that would cause immense problems later. Perhaps if Germany had been more democratic in 1870, it would have been less likely to blunder into World War I in 1914. Or perhaps not. It's impossible to say. But the relationship between political systems and the likelihood of war is worth thinking about. A third lesson is about the importance of moderation in victory. Bismarck's relatively lenient treatment of Austria in 1866 was wise. It prevented Austria from becoming a permanent enemy seeking revenge. Compare this to the treatment of France in 1871, where the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine created exactly that kind of permanent enmity. Or compare it to the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, where the harsh terms imposed on Germany helped create the conditions for World War II. Bismarck understood that you should defeat your enemies, not humiliate them. You should take what you need, not everything you can get. This restraint in victory is rare, but it's essential for creating a stable peace. Finally, we should remember the human cost of even the most brilliantly executed wars. The wars of German unification were, by the standards of later conflicts, relatively small and short, but they still killed over 150,000 soldiers and countless civilians. They destroyed cities and disrupted millions of lives. They created widows and orphans. They left physical and psychological scars that lasted generations. Every one of those deaths was a tragedy for someone. A father who never came home, a son who died far from his family, a husband who returned changed by what he had seen. Behind every strategic calculation, behind every diplomatic maneuver, behind every great historical event, there are individual human beings whose lives are forever altered. We should never forget that. Bismarck himself, in his final years, seemed to understand this. He was by then long retired, living on his estate in Friedrichsruh. He gave interviews occasionally, and in one of them, he reflected on his career. He said that he had been a servant of the Prussian state, that he had done what he believed necessary to make Prussia strong. But he also said that if he had it to do over again, he would have tried harder to achieve unification through peaceful means. He didn't know if it would have been possible, but he wished he had tried. Whether this was genuine regret or just the mellowing of old age is hard to say. But it suggests that even Bismarck, the master of blood and iron, understood that war always comes with costs that are hard to justify, no matter how brilliant the strategy or how complete the victory. The story of German unification through Bismarck's wars is ultimately a story about power, ambition, strategy, and the unintended consequences of even the most carefully planned actions. It's a story about how a brilliant statesman can reshape the world, but can't control what that world becomes after he's gone. It's a story about how military innovation and strategic vision can win wars, but can't necessarily win the peace. It's a story about how nationalism can unify a people, but can also divide them from their neighbors. And it's a story about how the decisions of a few men in palaces and parliaments can determine the fates of millions. When we think about Bismarck's wars today, we should think about all of these dimensions: the strategic brilliance and the human cost, the achievement of German unification and the problems that unification created, the short-term success and the long-term consequences, the careful calculation and the uncontrolled outcomes. This is what makes history so fascinating and so important. It's not just about what happened, but about what it means. And the meaning changes as we gain perspective, as we see how events unfold over decades and centuries. The wars that unified Germany in 1871 are still influencing European politics today. The borders Bismarck helped draw are still contested. The nationalist sentiments he helped unleash are still powerful. The lessons of those wars are still relevant. So as we come to the end of this long journey through blood and iron, through battlefields and negotiating tables, through the rise of the German Empire, what should we take away? Perhaps simply this: power matters in international affairs. Strategy and careful planning can achieve remarkable results. But power without restraint, strategy without wisdom, achievement without consideration of consequences, these things create more problems than they solve. Bismarck was a great statesman by almost any measure, but greatness in one era can create catastrophe in the next. The Germany he created with such skill would ultimately destroy itself and much of Europe in two terrible wars. This wasn't his intention, but it was, in some sense, his legacy. Understanding this helps us understand not just 19th century Europe, but the nature of power itself, in the eternal question of how to achieve security and prosperity without sowing the seeds of future conflict. The story of Bismarck's wars is a story worth knowing, worth thinking about, worth learning from. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, of brilliant strategy and terrible cost, of achievement and unintended consequences. It's ultimately a very human story, about leaders making difficult decisions, soldiers fighting and dying, civilians caught in the midst of great events beyond their control. It's history at its most dramatic and most instructive. And like all great historical stories, It has no simple lesson, no easy moral. It simply is. A moment when the world changed, when a new nation was born, when the balance of power shifted, when millions of lives were altered forever. Blood and iron, strategy and sacrifice, victory and defeat, all of it together, making the messy, complicated, fascinating tapestry of human history. This was how modern Germany was made. And this is why we still study it, still think about it, still try to understand it, more than 150 years later. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most pivotal periods. Rest well, and may these stories of the past help you reflect on the present and future.